Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of God is Not a Theory with Ken Fish. I'm your host, Grant Pemberton, live on the road, as you can see if you're watching on YouTube. But we are here, and we have a special guest, a living legend, honestly. Ken, why don't you give us a proper introduction of who today's guest is?
Yeah, this is Jerry's first time on the show. I know him as Jerry, but we really should call him General Boykin. Um, Jerry Boykin is a retired lieutenant general. That's a three-star general from the United States Army. We'll explore a little more about his background, so I don't want to steal all the thunder in the intro. But we got to know each other, I'm not sure, around 10 or 12 years ago, and we've run in some of the same circles. And from time to time, I've checked in with him for some guidance and input. My daughters have both gotten to know him, and he's become a kind of a mentor, particularly to my older daughter. And anyway, I'm just thrilled to have you on the show, Jerry. Thank you so much for taking time to join us today.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to this.
All right, well, let's get going. Before we really start talking about your fascinating life history, let's just lay the tracking of tell us how you came to faith in Jesus Christ. You're not only a retired general, you're a Christian.
Yeah, I grew up in the church, um, but the church that I grew up in and the denomination I grew up in was a very legalistic denomination, and um, I sort of determined pretty early in my life that I was not going to be able to live a Christian life because you didn't have to worry about what sin was because everything was a sin. If it looked good, smelled good, or tasted good, it had to be a sin. So I went off to college, played football at Virginia Tech as on a scholarship there, and I just kind of enjoyed my freedom. But then when I came in the Army, which was right out of college, the Lord said to me in that still small voice, He said, I have a plan for your life, but it will never be fulfilled unless you submit to me. And of course, I knelt down in the bachelor officer's quarters there at Fort Benning, Georgia. And I said, Lord, I'm tired of running. And if you'll forgive me, I'll live for you the rest of my life. And that's how I came to Christ. And I've had twists and turns since then, but I can assure you that He has been right with me. And I'm delighted to say that I am living for the Lord now.
Did you find any conflict between your faith and your responsibilities in the military as you were especially rising through the ranks and had more and more responsibility?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was talking to a young fellow that I'm mentoring out of one of the universities, and he wanted to talk about spiritual things. And one of the things he asked me was that very question. And I said, why, why do you ask me that? And he said, well, the Bible says. I said, well, yeah, I know what the Bible says, and I think maybe you don't. The Bible doesn't say thou shalt not kill. It says thou shalt not murder. So if you believe that the Bible says thou shalt not kill, you also have to believe that by the time the Israelites got to the Jordan River, God had changed his mind from what he gave them on Mount Sinai, because he said to Joshua, when you cross that river, kill them all. He said, kill them all. Now stop and think about that. How could he say, thou shalt not kill, and then tell them, kill them all? So I have no issue whatsoever with being a military guy that has been in combat and has been associated with the kinds of things that we find distasteful but are necessary. And so I'll say one other thing, and that is we need to reflect on the fact that the Bible says the Lord is a warrior. Exodus 15:3. The Lord is a warrior. The Lord is his name. And Revelation 19 says when he comes back, what's he coming back as? He's coming back as a warrior, wearing a blood-stained white robe, leading a mighty army with a sword coming out of his mouth. I have no issue with being in the military.
That is spoken with real conviction, and I know you well enough to know that there's no excess in that. That's just the way it is. And I would add, I think in much of modern conversation about the Lord, in particularly the charismatic camp, I think we've almost feminized God. We've certainly made him softer, kinder, gentler. And in some contexts, it's appropriate to highlight those aspects of him. But we've downplayed this other side that you just brought forward so much that I think, a lot of people almost they don't know that God can actually have that side to him. We might call that the God of justice as opposed to the God of mercy. But
Yeah,
whichever way you characterize it, that is still part of who he is.
yeah, I agree with you on every point you made there.
Yeah. All right. Well, so you're the first senior ranking military officer we've had on our program. We've had people on who have had military experience, but you've been there at the, as we say, top of the feeding chain. Give us a brief history of your military career, just so our listeners have a sense of who you are, what you've done, where you've been, and what your lifelong career with the military looked like until you finally hit retirement age.
Yeah, I'll truncate this a little bit because it's 36 years, so it would take more time than we want to on this program to tell you. But I came out of the ROTC program at Virginia Tech, and I went right in the Army. I mean, the next week I was in the Army, and my first assignment was Fort Hood, Texas, and from there I was sent to Korea, and from Korea I was sent to Vietnam for a short period. And then I came back and I did a couple of conventional assignments. I went into the Ranger Battalion when that was stood up and served in the Ranger Battalion. And then the Delta Force was being formed. And I didn't know that it was the Delta Force. I didn't have any clue. I just get this call that says, we're going to ask you to volunteer for a new unit that's being formed at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and it's going to be the toughest thing you've ever done. And we're going to ask you to go through a course 30 days long, and you better be in the best shape you've ever been in. And that's all they told me. So I reported to Fort Bragg, and I went through the Delta Force assessment and selection program. And I made it through. I was one of 19 out of 118 that started. So I felt blessed, but again, by that time I was living my faith and I was really trusting the Lord to, if he wanted me to be part of that, to get me through it. So I got through that and I spent 13 years there at the Delta Force. And the final 2 years, I was the commander of the entire Delta Force. And then I got promoted to Brigadier General, and I went off on a classified mission over in Europe when the Balkans War was going on. We were actually going in and capturing war criminals. It was an interesting program. And then I came to Fort Bragg, and I became the commander of all of the Green Berets in the U.S. Army. And then I commanded the school that trains the Green Berets. And then I went to Washington under George W. Bush, and I was the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence for my last 4 years. And that's the truncated version of 36 years.
Amazing. Now, there was a period of time, from my memory, maybe I have this wrong, but the Army would neither confirm nor deny that the Delta Force even existed. It was kind of a shadowy, rumored organization, but I can remember for some time you could never really get a firm lock on whether it actually was there. Do I have that right?
Theoretically, yeah, theoretically, the Army still doesn't talk about Delta Force. It's unlike the SEALs. You know, the SEALs get a lot of publicity, but Delta Force doesn't, and that's the way it was designed that way. But the reality is that they made a movie called Black Hawk Down, right?
Mhm.
All about the Delta Force. And the military, the Army supported that. The Army sent helicopters, and then on the other hand, they say, we don't talk about that. We don't, well, you can't have it both ways. So I find it, you know, kind of ridiculous. Look, when they go to an installation in the Army to recruit people to come through the selection course, what do they tell them they're coming to? They tell them they're coming to the Delta Force. Yet we don't talk about that. So it's silly. It's just silly.
Yeah, you're talking out of two sides of your mouth when you do that. Now, you just mentioned a movie. I remember seeing it, although I haven't watched it in years, called Black Hawk Down. It was about a battle that occurred in Mogadishu, Somalia. And as I recall, a warlord named, from memory, Muhammad Farah Aidid was one of the foci of that particular mission. You were in Mogadishu for that. Is there anything of it that you can share that isn't classified and that you'd like to share about that mission?
Yeah, I mean, I in my autobiography, Never Surrender, I talk about quite a bit of that operation because it was a defining point in my life. And that's another story altogether where I just, for a short period of time, I just lost my faith. I just lost my faith. But that said, um, Muhammad Farid, you're absolutely right. And good memory. You're not old enough yet to start losing your memory, I guess. But um, he was a warlord. He was the leader of the Habagitter clan, and he wanted to control all of Somalia, starting with the capital city of Mogadishu. And he was an evil, diabolical man. I mean, just evil. And you could just feel, and I'll say something that some people watching your program may say, oh my gosh, he's one of those. But you could feel the intensity of the demonic forces in Mogadishu.
Mm.
You could feel it. When I got off the airplane, you could feel it. And he was at the top of the heap there in terms of the demonic influence that he had there. So, but we went into that city 6 times before we got into that big fight on the 7th time. And we had only 2 people that we had injured. Was one guy got shrapnel in his leg, and another guy got a piece of shrapnel in his face, and that's all that we had any problems with leading up to the 3rd of October, 1993, which is when we got into the big fight that resulted in the Black Hawks going down. There were actually 2 Black Hawks going down, and we obviously, once the second Black Hawk went down, we really had a problem because we had sent everybody to the first Black Hawk to get the people out of that. And then all of a sudden, we got another one that goes down. And now we're grabbing the cooks and the clerks and the bottle washers, if you will, putting a gun in their hands and we gave them some leadership, and they went out there and did a very good job. I mean, these were not people that were trained as infantrymen, but they did a good job. And the only one that came out of that crash, though, was the co-pilot, and he came out because there were two men, Randy Shugart and Gary Gordon, who wound up getting the Medal of Honor because they were snipers flying around over the crash, and they begged 3 times. They said, "Put us in, put us in." And finally they said, "Sir, put us in. We're the only hope." And we put them in, and they were both killed. But they got the people out of the crash. They protected those people in that crash until they were both killed. And then one of the guys survived. The Somalis didn't kill the co-pilot. And so he came to tell us the story about it. But I must tell you, it was an example of the kind of people that selection process finds. Everybody's critical of the process because they don't understand it. They don't understand what its purpose is. This is part of the Sodality thing, you know. And we, I think, had some of the most courageous people, but that's not the issue. We had the most committed people. They had a transcendent cause, and that transcendent cause was their buddy on the right and their left.
Yeah.
And that flag flying over their compound there. So that's probably what I can tell you, unless there's something specific that you want to know.
No, I think you've actually touched on the very essence of what I wanted to talk about today. But before we dive into the tank now, let me just ask, what was the logic for the formation of the Delta Force? Why did it need to come into existence? Said another way, why wasn't the regular army enough? Why weren't the Green Beret or the Rangers enough? Why did you need this specialized unit?
Yeah, this started in 1977, actually. And it started because suddenly the nation looked around and said, what are we going to do about this thing called terrorism?
Mm.
And there had been the Israelis had gone into Entebbe and run a raid there to get their people back, and they did. And the Germans had recovered an airplane that had been taken by Islamic terrorists, and the Germans went into Mogadishu, of all places. They went in and rescued the people on the plane. And there were several of those. There was a train that was hijacked in in Frankfurt. And one of our senior generals was almost killed in a terror attack in Germany. So the nation said, do we have that kind of capability? Can we do that? And after some discussion and all, they said, no, we can't. Why? Because this is going to require special people. They might not be good at anything else, but they're going to be good at this, and they're going to be the right people in here. And that's why we have this process. But we're going to have the right people in there, but they're going to be prepared to do whatever is needed. In other words, you need an artilleryman, we'll give you the best artilleryman you can have. You know, that wasn't a part of it, but the fact was that we were saying, give us just a little bit of time, and we'll be ready to do whatever you call us to do. And that was the reason. And that, man, let me tell you, the Special Forces and the Rangers, that was not something they wanted to see or wanted to hear. And the rest of the Army thought, well, we were just going to be a waste of money. So we had a lot of love opposition, so to speak.
Well, that's a really good segue to where I really want to go with this show today. And friends that are listening, I, I didn't just bring Jerry on to talk about military matters. Everything you've just heard kind of sets the stage for what I want to talk about, which is the difference between modalities and sodalities. Now, these are words you probably have never heard, or if you have, you don't hear them in common conversation really ever. But people who study organizations note that all organizations, particularly larger ones, as they grow and need to differentiate, they exist as both modalities and sodalities. Now, the difference is to join a sodality requires a higher level of commitment. We might call it a second yes. There might be additional training, specialization, and more. The things that Jerry's just been talking about are representative of that in a military context, but this also exists in a churchly context. And we'll explore that a bit more. In contradistinction to a sodality, a modality is really, in his context, it would be the general army. It would be every man, and we might almost say lowest common denominator. We want to have a big tent. We want to have a place for everybody. And there's a place for that in the world of the church. But there are also these equivalents of a special operations group, which is what the Delta Force is, as the Green Beret, as the Rangers. And they exist because they have a particular mission. All right, so with all of this in mind, the Delta Force really appears to be a classic sodality within the wider modality of the regular U.S. Army. So, having said all of that, how does the culture of the Delta Force differ from that of the wider U.S. Army? And how does that contribute to the success of the Delta Force, Jerry?
Yeah. The idea behind the selection process came from the Brits, came from the Special Air Service, and they go all the way back to World War II with David Sterling, who stood up that. And it was a process that would take you into a situation that you really had never been in before. And that is that we were putting these people out in the mountains in the winter, I might add, with snow on the ground and with very heavy loads. And each man by himself had to go from point to point through the mountains. And every day you would see the numbers thin out. And that was not always because they didn't have the physical capabilities. It was frequently, in fact, most of the time, it was that they just couldn't deal with this not knowing how much time they had to get to the next point. We didn't tell them anything except here's where you start, and right now, here's where you're standing, and here's where you're going. And okay, how long do I have to get there? Well, that's the point. That's the point. Do you have to have a definitive time, or are you going to put out everything you got to get there as quickly as you can? Are you going to challenge yourself? And the other thing was, we were looking for people that were innovative. There's a book that I read several years ago called Churchill's Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare. And it's all about, and there's a movie on it now, and it's worth seeing. But it was all about Churchill standing up what ultimately became the OSS, Office of Strategic Services, which was the predecessor to the CIA as well as the Special Forces. And the whole idea was to get people that can think on their feet, that are not afraid of something new, that are not afraid of something different. They're willing to embrace those things, because our military is so rigid that we don't show a value for kind of the entrepreneurial approach to things.
Mhm.
And that's what we were looking for. We were looking for those people. In fact, some of the people that we got were not particularly well thought of in the units they came from. But when they came to us and we said, your only restrictions, your only boundaries are legal, ethical, and moral. You do the job that you're given and you stay within those bounds, nobody's going to question you. You're going to be fine, and you will get through it. But if you break those things, you're gone. You're gone.
Yeah.
You're out of here. So that was what we were looking for. That's how, we needed people that not only would they bond with each other, but they were comfortable if we had to send them off on a one-man mission. If we had to send them off to do something by themselves, and we did all the time, they had to be able to do it without the team encouragement. They had to do it because they had analyzed the mission and they were up to the task. And that is something in the military that there's not a lot of emphasis on creativity, if you will. And it's more a matter of, what does the book say? What's the strategy that you were taught in basic training or in the war college or whatever? Well, we threw that stuff out. We didn't violate Army regulations, but we threw that stuff out and let people come up with their own solutions to things. And in doing that, they were just brilliant. So that was part of why the rest of the military had some issues with us, is because we weren't doing things the way they did. And that was a tough one to swallow.
Now, as I listen to you talk about this, you said a couple things I want to restate for the benefit of our listeners. You said they were required to act legally, meaning within the confines of, well, more broadly, the laws of war, but more particularly the laws of the United States Army. What are the rules of engagement, and when you can do certain things and not do certain things. So they had to be legal, they had to be ethical, and they had to be moral. So those three things had to be true. But you also said that they were people who had kind of an entrepreneurial bent. They thought outside the box. And you're talking about a warfighting organization, but when I hear you say that, I think of my own business experience, and you've just described Silicon Valley, which is a hotbed of innovation. And, it's one of the main economic drivers of the US economy. And these things are prized. And you mentioned that in many ways the Army is, by the book, and sometimes people use the term hidebound. And I've heard people use that type of language with regard not only to the Army, but the Navy and the Air Force, et cetera. But what you're really saying then is these are people who, because of their bent, because of their proclivity, we might say because of their calling, they're a little bit rogue. They stay in bounds legally, ethically, and morally, but in every other way, they bump up against the boundaries, and a lot of times people don't necessarily like that. Is that a fair restatement of everything you just said?
No question about it. We were at Fort Bragg. Now, keep in mind, Fort Bragg is the home of the 82nd Airborne. It's also the home of the headquarters and at least two of the Special Forces groups. That's all at Fort Bragg. That's where the majority of our problems came from. is they thought this is a mission we can do, and what they would say was, just give us the information. I mean, give us the money, give us the material, and we can do this. Well, that shows that you don't have any clue what we're about here. We're trying to find people that are different, people that have certain qualities. Doesn't mean they're better than you are, but they are different than you are. And they have certain qualities that you don't have. And that's why they were on our backs all the time. Now, the big army, that was Fort Bragg and the Special Forces and the 82nd Airborne. But the bigger army, the generals, the 3 and 4 stars, they just thought we were just going to be another bunch of cowboys. And in fact, they said that. You're just cowboys. No, we're not. And what they thought was, I think some of them actually feared us. It was the 7th day in May, but I think that they did. But then there were some, there were some guys up there on the military staff, particularly on the Army staff and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that got it. They got it right away. And they thought it was a brilliant idea. And they stood with us. So we had just enough in the right place that we were able to keep going until we got to where we needed to be, and we were declared operational. And it was hard seeing people in the Army being so critical of us because they didn't know anything about us.
Yeah.
And the attrition was about 83%. So a lot of these guys were coming home saying, "Oh, I wouldn't go back and do that again. It's nothing. It's just walking in the mountains." Well, no, it's a little more than that, and it's designed to bring you to the point that you either say, "I'm going to make it through this thing," or you say, "I don't need this," and you go home. And
Yeah.
either one is okay with us, but we put a lot into that, and the Brits came over and helped us with it at the very beginning, and they were helpful.
All right, so there are a lot of parallels and analogies we could draw here. This is a about an hour long podcast, so we can't say everything. But when we look at the history of the church, there have been many sodalities within the history of the church, and in many cases, like you're describing with the Delta Force, there was a lot of misunderstanding of what these sodalities were, or what they did, or what their intentions were. In the Middle Ages, among the sodalities of the Catholic Church, we had earlier the Benedictines, and that would have been maybe in the 5th century. As we move into the late 11th century, we've got the Franciscans and the Dominicans, and later on, around the time of the Reformation, we get the Jesuits, and these are just a few. But that's the Catholic Church. In the Protestant world, we've had other organizations. For example, Campus Crusade for Christ, now known as CRU, CRU, InterVarsity, Frontiers, Operation Mobilization, the Navigators. There are many others. I'm just throwing a few names out that are relatively well known within Christendom. Anyway, what do you think we can learn about the culture of a sodality within the church by studying the relationship that the Delta Force had with the U.S. Army, including, by the way, opposition from what you might have thought were actually part of the Brotherhood?
Yeah, I think we can learn a lot from them. But one thing that when I read your questions and all earlier, it dawned on me, there's another sodality that I would consider to be a sodality, and that is home churches, non-denominational churches. And why is this that all of a sudden we've got all of these churches that are growing and they're non-denominational? I think that the church, in many cases, not all, but in many cases, is locked into doctrine and what shall I say, the doctrine and an absolute insistence upon everything being done the same way over and over and over. And I think one of the reasons for the home churches and the non-denominational churches is there's so many people that have been burned by the church. You know, they are in these legalistic churches or these churches that are unchanging. And then they find out the pastor, you know, had a girlfriend at one point. And that just destroys people. I mean, that people don't realize how much that hurts a Christian that is, especially a new Christian. And so I think that that is a part of this whole concept of the Sodalities is the home church and the non-denominational churches. And I think that I think we can look at how the Delta Force came about. We can look at the idea behind it. And I think that it could have some meaning to the church today. And I think that it would be beneficial for them to actually do that. Because, you know, we even had Sodalities within Delta Force. It was a Sodality, but we had other Sodalities within the Delta Force. If you're a skydiver, a military free fall guy, you would probably be on one of the skydiving teams, if you would. And that's a terrible term to use. You'd be on one of the military free fall teams. But now, of course, everybody's trained in military free fall, in Delta at least. But we had those kinds of things. We had others that were trained in mountaineering. And they're again, that was another Sodality in a Sodality. And then you had those that were what we would call the motor guys. We had those that could drive anything, that could operate anything, any kind of heavy equipment or whatever. If it had wheels, they could use it. So those were the kinds of things that we had. And then, of course, we had recon teams. And you know, again, another Sodality.
Very interesting. Is there a particular point at which a Sodality starts differentiating into further Sodalities, or is it more ad hoc?
It's like everything. You got the human factor in there. And what we wanted to see and what we still want to see today is, regardless of what Sodality you're in within that Sodality, you better be making progress towards the next generation of tactics, techniques, procedures, and the next generation of materiel, technology. And if you're sitting back and not moving forward, then we need to move you to something different, because you're not going to be what we need to take us into the next decade. And that was a big thing. And I think that right now, Delta Force probably has, in many ways, some of the best technology and certainly some of the best tactics, techniques, and procedures in any military anywhere.
Got it. All right. So again, trying to draw lessons from your experience in the military, there are times when church Sodalities are viewed, well, depends on who's looking at them, but it tends to be more the modalities. They view the sodalities as distractions or maybe less important than the mission of the wider church. Did you ever find yourself, once the Delta Force was operating, needing to, I'll say, re-justify uh, the legitimacy of the Delta Force within the U.S. Army? And if you did, how did you do that? How did you go about doing it?
Yeah, that was not a major problem because the at least in the early days, because the leaders that were there had been through this battle uh, to to be recognized, this battle to be supported, this battle to show everybody that we were not a threat to them. But as that generation moved out, you had another generation that came in, and they didn't have the advantage of that experience. So now they don't know that there are people out there that really don't want you to be there, that really don't think you should be there, that don't think you're necessary. And those people are never going to go away. And every generation that comes in, you need to be aware of that. And I think you see, in many ways, I think you see the same thing in the church. And I think that in the church, I'll give you an example. Dear friend of mine, he was my pastor for a long time. He is 80 plus years old and still has not found a successor for himself because he hasn't tried.
Mm.
Because anybody that he brought in would be a threat to him.
Mm.
And I think that this is one of the reasons that we have some of these problems like you're talking about, is that pastors are afraid that if he brings somebody in to start training them, that he'll move them out before they're ready. And I loved my pastor, but in fact, he's dead now. I shouldn't have said he's in his 80s. He was in his 80s when he died. He's dead now, but he is a wonderful guy, but he never set himself up to have somebody that can step in for him. So I think that we have to promote, the leadership in the church has to promote not gimmicks, but legitimate things that would help the church to do what the church is called to do. And we've got some guys that come out with these kind of ridiculous things, but we've got a lot of people that have some brilliant ideas about things that the church should be doing, things that would enhance not only the reputation of the church, but the effectiveness of the church. And if you don't have those kind of people, you need to. And pastors, this is my view, never been a pastor, but pastors need to have a board that is not just a rubber stamp. It's a board that thinks. It's a board that can give advice. It's a board that can work through problems. And I've got to tell you, in the churches I've been in, I can honestly say I've only seen one that I would say they had figured that out, and they had the right people as the elders or the board members or whatever you call them.
Last question. You're currently working for the Family Research Council, which is unmistakably a sodality. What points of learning or encouragement can you share with our listeners who may feel the call to Christian service, as you are now doing, but not as conventional pastors or church planters? They feel called to a sodality, not a modality? What kind of encouragement can you give them as someone who's operating in a sodality?
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. We are a sodality, and we are a Christian organization. And as a Christian organization, we have a network of pastors that we're in touch with, that we consider them part of our network of pastors and churches. And we are doing everything we can to keep them informed on what's going on. There's so much going on in this country, and around the world, but we're trying everything we can to keep them informed and to make sure that they know what's going on in the country that impacts all of us as Christians, especially. And we have a multitude of things that we do to support our responsibilities as Christians. And in fact, in April, I'm going to Israel and spend some time there in Israel with some of their military people. I had lived over there previously with the Golani Brigade, and so I'm going back over there and spend some time with them. But that's part of what we do at the Family Research Council, and there are others. We're not the only one. There are others who are doing a great job as well in terms of keeping the information flow going to the right places. So it's been a privilege for the last 13 years to be part of the Family Research Council.
Well, I know when you were given that job or appointed, I was really excited because I think FRC does very good work, and I'm a huge fan of yours. So I thought this is maybe a match made in heaven might be overstating it, but I thought it was a good fit.
Well, I look forward to seeing you. You let me know when you're going to be in Washington again, and we'll go have lunch or something, and we'll fix all the world's problems.
Okay, that sounds good. Well, I'll close it out here. Grant Pemberton is traveling, and he's in a place where the coverage has dropped out. So he won't be closing us today. I'll do that. And if you're watching this on YouTube, my face is frozen. I don't know what's going on with my computer, but you can hear my voice, but my image hasn't moved now in something like a minute or so. I apologize for that. But Jerry, thank you so much for coming on and talking with us about sodalities and modalities and the lessons we can learn as Christian leaders who may feel called to sodality type work in the midst of a modality centric world.
Well, thank you for having me on.
Well, we'll have you back again, and maybe we'll dive a little deeper into this tank, because I think there's a lot to be said and learned by looking cross-disciplinary, military, business, church. It's amazing how these patterns recur because they're all human organizations, even if the church exists under God's hand. All right. Well, with that, we'll close. Thank you all for joining us for another episode of God is Not a Theory. We'll be back here next week at the same time with another new episode to get you thinking about how God is real in your world. He is not a theory, and he wants to intersect the life you live. God bless you. See you next time.
If you are blessed by the content on this podcast, please pay it forward and click on the donation link in the description of this episode. To support Ken directly, you can select the Ken Fish Support Fund. Or, if you would like to give to support the rest of the team, select the General Fund. Thank you so much for your consideration. We are deeply grateful to all of our financial partners.